Hello, everyone, and welcome to our October Improving Lives Through Art event, the second event of the MSAA 2021-2022 Improving Lives Through Art series, and the first virtual tour this season. My name is Joe Caliva, and I will be your host this evening. I am so grateful and honored to be back this season. And I cannot wait to share more stories with you about artists who improved their own lives and the lives of others through art, despite some considerable health challenges. So thank you to MSAA for inviting me back. And before we begin, as always, I would like to introduce the president and CEO of MSAA, Ms. Gina Murdoch, for a special message to help us get the night started. Gina?
Welcome to the next in our series of our Improving Lives Through Art events. Tonight, you will have a very special guided tour with our host, Joe Caliva, who will take us from Modigliani to Monet, artists that have used art as a form of therapeutic expression. Thanks to Publicis, who is our diamond sponsor for tonight. I would also like to invite you to our next event on December 7th. That evening, we'll take an intimate look at a handful of our art showcased artists and see how they have used art along their MS journey. I know you will be as inspired by the personal stories and the artwork as I have been. So we are all ready for our guided tour. Thank you so much for your support. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you so much, Gina. It's always great to see you, and thank you for coming this evening. And before we get started, I would like to just make a few announcements to get you up to speed on some of our other upcoming events. So first, you want to mark your calendars right now so that you do not miss our next Improving Lives Through Art event on November 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern for another paint along with our favorite painting instructor, Hannah Garrison. Yours truly will once again have the honor of hosting, but Hannah is the real star of the show, and she'll be guiding us in creating our very own holiday cards. So mark your calendars for that, November 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you are inspired by the artists you'll learn about tonight, be sure to check out the MSAA Art Showcase on their website at mymsaa.org. It features contemporary artists living with MS and improving their lives and the lives of others through art. So once again, go to mymsaa.org/art showcase to check that out. And speaking of the art showcase, mark your calendars now for our December Improving Lives Through Art event, as you heard Gina mention, a continuation of the series you're watching tonight. But this time it will feature the art and artists of the MSAA Art Showcase. I've recently had the incredible honor of interviewing some of these remarkable artists who are living with MS and creating some exceptional work. So you don't want to miss this. December 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you are an artist living with MS, or you know an artist living with MS, the MSAA is now accepting submissions for their 2022 art showcase. You can submit between now and December 13th. So take some photos of your best work and submit them at support.mymsaa.org/art showcase. I can't wait to see your work featured in next year's showcase. In a non-art related announcement, Team MSAA has spots for all 3 Run Disney race weekends for all race levels. If you would like to join Team MSAA for one of these races, you can visit the Endurance Events landing page, which Christy will share in the chat. But it is support.mymsaa.org/endurance events. Also, I encourage you to go to the mymsaa.org website and consider donating one of the amounts that you see here. Your donations go directly to support the services that MSAA provides, which are greatly needed. So you can go to the website link that Christy will share in the chat, because it's a very long link and hard to remember. So thank you, Christy, for that. And thank you for considering donating to the MSAA. And finally, I would like to echo Gina Murdoch's gratitude to our wonderful sponsor, Publicis Health, for making tonight's presentation and the entire Improving Lives Through Art series possible. Thank you to Publicis Health. So this past spring, the wonderful team at MSAA asked me to create a virtual tour presentation featuring historic artists who improved their wellness through art, or who used art as a way to cope with considerable health challenges. The presentation was titled From Michelangelo to Munch, a virtual tour of historical artists, wellness, and the transformative power of art. And it featured the stories of 4 historic artists who used art to give themselves a sense of purpose and improve their overall wellness. I joked that night that we needed to make that event a series because there were far too many artists to fit in one presentation who faced some sort of considerable health challenge. Well, in large part due to the overwhelming response from you, the viewers, here we are. I'm so moved that so many of you are excited to learn more about these artists, and I can't wait to share their stories with you. And since we already talked about Michelangelo and Munch, I needed a new name. So after a minor adjustment to the name of our Improving Lives Through Art series, tonight I present to you Lives Improved Through Art, historic artists who used art to improve their overall wellness despite difficult health challenges. And I would like to begin this evening with this man, one of the most famous figures in art, Mr. Claude Monet, a name that is probably familiar to many of you as the artist who was primarily responsible for one of the greatest movements in art history. But to understand the true impact Monet had on the history of art, we need to start here, at the Institut de France in Paris, home of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, or Academy of Fine Arts. This is how it looks today, and here it is back around the middle of the 19th century. Around this time, the Académie dominated French art and pretty much defined the standards for the style and content of what was considered acceptable in French painting. Its standards and teachings were based in large part on the writings of this man, art theoretician André Philibert, from all the way back to the 1600s. He ranked the genres of art from what he thought was the highest to the lowest. He believed that historical paintings, or those portraying religious or mythological themes, were the most noble or honorable paintings. Portraiture was a close second, since he considered it godlike to represent or recreate the image of man, which he thought was God's greatest creation. Paintings of ordinary people and ordinary life, or what is known as genre paintings, were okay, but landscapes and still lifes were not really worth anyone's time and not at all a noble pursuit as an artist. For centuries, this was the accepted school of thought, especially by the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris, which also preferred carefully finished images like this one that looked very realistic when you examine them closely. They also preferred the use of color to be muted or restrained, as we can see in this portrait by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. Focus was more on the drawing, and color was often applied with a very limited palette. But around 1862, a 22-year-old art student in Paris named Claude Monet was itching to break the old standards of beauty in art, and he wanted to explore new ground. Having just returned from military service in Northern Africa, he was inspired by the light and vivid colors he saw there. He wrote later that his time in Algeria contained the germ of my future researches. Fortunately, he met several other artists at the studio where he was studying who shared this newfound passion: Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frederic Bazille. They discovered that they all shared an interest in painting landscape and contemporary life rather than the tired old historical or mythological scenes. So Monet and his classmates began meeting in the countryside together to paint outside, or as artists still call it today, in plein air. But they weren't just making sketches to be brought back and finished in the studio, as was the usual practice then. They were actually starting and finishing the painting completely out in the field. They believed that by painting in sunlight directly from nature, and by making strong use of the vivid synthetic pigments that were becoming more and more available, they could more accurately represent the vibrant colors found in nature. They began to develop a lighter and brighter method of painting and redefined the meaning of realism in art, not by focusing on the drawing or precise brushstrokes or the laborious blending or the small details to create a hyper-realistic, perfect likeness. They defined realism by accurately representing the effects of light on color. They sought to capture the essence of a subject rather than its finer details. The 4 paintings by Monet that we just viewed are all located here at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In those paintings and the ones you see here, you can clearly see Monet's healthy obsession not only with landscapes, but with water as well. In particular, the Seine River, which runs right through Paris and around which Monet lived most of his life. But it would be this painting of the Seine River that would inadvertently give a name to one of the most pivotal movements in the history of art. In 1872, at a special exhibit organized to showcase the work of Monet and his ever-growing band of rebellious artists, spending all this time painting outdoors and defying convention, Monet entered this piece and called it Impression Sunrise, in part because it had to be finished very quickly due to the light rapidly changing. So Monet was only able to capture the essential elements to give the viewer the impression of the scene. A critic and humorist named Louis Leroy, who attended the exhibition, wrote a review in the newspaper Le Charivari, in which he wrote that Monet's painting was at most a sketch, and that wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. He titled his article, "The Exhibition of the Impressionists," trying to use the title of Monet's painting as an insult to the artists who painted in this new style. But it didn't have the effect Leroy wanted. The name actually gained favor with the public and with the artists themselves. And so Impressionism was born. Over the next 40 years, Monet continued to develop and refine this new method of painting. And though many other Impressionist artists eventually moved on to other methods or movements, Monet remained committed and would go on to become what some art historians have described as the driving force behind Impressionism. But as Impressionism evolved, so did Monet. One of the primary goals of Impressionism was to depict the transience of light and to capture scenes of modern life and the natural world in their ever-shifting conditions. In the 1880s, Monet began exploring a new way to depict these transient qualities by painting the same scene or subject as a series several times in different conditions, as you can see in these two paintings at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Both of those paintings are of the Rouen Cathedral, a beautiful structure in Rouen, Normandy, France, featuring early Gothic and Renaissance style architecture. But in these two paintings, Monet paints the same view of the west facade of the cathedral, the one on the left later in the day when the sunlight was shining directly on this side of the building. In fact, Monet painted the cathedral more than 30 times, at different times of the day, during different times of the year, different seasons, in different weather conditions, all in an attempt to illustrate the importance of light in our perception of a subject at a given time and place. Another of his most notable series is commonly known as Haystacks, or the Wheat Stacks series. Once again, over the span of about a year, Monet tirelessly painted and repainted the same scene, the same subjects, over and over again, to try and capture in paint these fleeting moments, which only lasted mere seconds, to once again try and illustrate the nuances in our perception of light across these natural variations. Monet ultimately painted 25 canvases in this series, each one a masterpiece in its own right, but altogether they are a monumental accomplishment and a clear testament to the genius of this remarkable artist. During the time he was painting the cathedral and the Wheat Stack series, Monet had relocated himself and his family to a small village named Giverny, which was about 50 miles or 80 kilometers from Paris. There, he converted this old house and the gardens that surround it into a natural oasis, where he could be surrounded by nature and paint outdoors or in plein air whenever he liked. And here is where he found the inspiration for his next great series, this small Japanese footbridge and the water lily pool around it. It was one of Monet's favorite spots in the more than 2.5 acre garden. The gardens would be the primary source of inspiration for Monet for more than 40 years. And he painted the Japanese footbridge more than 25 times. The water lilies in the pond, even more than that. This particular painting is located in the National Gallery in London. But here at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., you can find another of these paintings from around the same time in 1899. And even closer to home, here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there's yet another one from the same year, 1899. All three are remarkably similar and capture the beauty and serenity of the pond and the bridge. But around the corner in a neighboring gallery at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there's another footbridge painting. But this one is from approximately 20 years later, and there is something strikingly different. This is not just an exploration of the effects of light on color. This seems like an abstraction or a distortion from the point of view of the painter himself. What happened that had such a powerful impact on Monet's perception of this lovely bridge and pond? In 1913, Monet began to develop the first signs of cataracts, one of the worst fears for a visual artist. Over the next few years, his perception of color was suffering. His broad strokes were becoming broader, and his paintings were becoming increasingly darker. He tried several treatments, but he didn't want to undergo surgery for fear of permanently losing his vision. He began to label his tubes of paint since it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to tell them apart. And to help reduce the glare of the sun, which further impeded his vision when he painted outdoors, he began wearing a straw hat, giving us the image of Monet that his admirers all know so well. But what Monet didn't do was stop painting his beloved lily pond and footbridge. Despite the obstacles he now faced with his vision, he soldiered on to create one of the most moving series of images in art history. Starting just a couple years after first moving to Giverny and completing the bridge in 1895, and not yet having any of the water lilies in the pond beneath it. Then moving to a few years later in 1899, as he continued to nourish the gardens and add more and more plant life around the bridge, and of course, his treasured water lilies. Creating a natural paradise surrounded by a symphony of colors that he could observe changing throughout the day or throughout the year in different seasons. The colors were constantly shifting and changing as the glorious light danced around through time and space. You can see the hand of the painter in the thick layers of paint and the energetic brushstrokes. Monet's spirit and sense of joy almost runs right off these canvases. And then they continue, picking up a few years after the cataracts began to rob Monet of his beloved color. An illness robbed him of his beloved wife, Alice, and his oldest son, Jean. These later series of footbridge paintings serve a different purpose than the cathedral or haystack series. Instead of illustrating the transient effects of light on color, they create a poignant visual record of one man confronting his greatest fears and his greatest losses. We are looking through the eyes of someone losing their eyesight. But to borrow a quote I hear very often from people living with MS, who say that they may have MS, but MS doesn't have them. In Monet's case, he may have had cataracts, but the cataracts certainly didn't have him. Fortunately, after finally undergoing surgery years after he began the first symptoms of the cataracts, and after going through some other corrective procedures, Monet's vision slightly improved, or at least didn't get any worse. And as if he hadn't achieved enough already, in 1914, at the age of 73, Monet had a vision for what would be his final act: a large circular installation of vast paintings that he would create and envelop the viewer in an expanse of water, flora, and sky. The vision materialized in the form of some 40 large-scale panels, which he called his Grande Decoration. He worked and reworked on them continuously from 1914 until his death in 1926. The largest installation of these monumental canvases is here at the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, in an oval gallery that was built in 1927 specifically to house these works, which span a total length of 91 meters, or almost 300 feet. Some art historians have called it the world's first art installation because the space was designed specifically for Monet's paintings. You can sit in the center of the room, immersed in a sea of color, and be transported into the gardens of Giverny. A little closer to home, at the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York City, you can find a tranquil little gallery tucked away here on the 5th floor with this one large water lily canvas, and right next to it, this 3-panel or triptych canvas as well. This enormous undertaking was conceived and completed while Monet struggled with his failing vision due to the cataracts. This achievement proves, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that physical limitations, while certainly challenging, are no match for the creative spirit. And though an artist like Monet may lose his sight due to an illness, it can never rob him of his vision. So, as we continue in our journey, learning about historic artists whose lives were improved through art, or who improved their overall wellness through art, I'd like to introduce you to an Italian-born artist named Amedeo Modigliani. As always, let's start with a little history. Modigliani was born in the northwestern part of Italy, in the Tuscany region, in a small coastal town called Livorno, along what was once called the Etruscan coast on the Ligurian Sea. He was born in a small house on this busy-looking street, where you can still visit his early childhood home. His parents named him Amedeo, which means lover of God, and nicknamed him Dado. The woman in this photo is not his mother, but most likely a nurse. And this is the only known photo of Modigliani as a baby. In fact, there aren't many photos of Modigliani in his youth at all. You're looking at pretty much the sum total. The photo on the right is believed to be of Dado sometime between the ages of 8 and 10. The center photo is of him around the same age in a school play. The large photo on the left is young Modigliani around the age of 14, caught telling a joke to Giovanni Fattori, one of his mentors and quite a well-known painter himself. And the small photo on the left was taken in 1899 of Dado in a painting studio with some of his classmates. Not much is known about his early years between birth and 11 years old. His mother, Eugenie Garçon Modigliani, took care of most of his education. And she recognized his creativity and potential as an artist from an early age. She wrote in her journal once, "We shall have to wait and see what is inside this chrysalis. Perhaps an artist." He was very close to his mother since his siblings were much older than he was, and his father wasn't around much. And being the youngest of four children, I think it's safe to say he was probably her favorite as well. This drawing is a self-portrait by Modigliani, drawn in 1899 when he was only 15 years old. It's a remarkable example of how talented he was at a very young age. Also, it was created during a very difficult period in the young artist's life. A few years earlier, in the summer of 1895, when Dado was only 11, he developed a sharp pain in his chest so bad that it was difficult to breathe. He was diagnosed with pleurisy, a painful inflammation of the lungs. And though he recovered, it was an unfortunate omen to the poor health Modigliani would be plagued with for the rest of his life. In August 1898, when Modigliani was 14, he fell gravely ill again. This time, it was typhoid. It took him more than a month to recover from this very aggressive infection, but the disease most likely made him more susceptible to something even worse. In September 1900, at the age of 16, Modigliani and two other students at the studio where he was studying in Livorno contracted tuberculosis. It was the most deadly disease worldwide at the turn of the 20th century, and there was no known cure at the time. His two classmates didn't survive, and it took young Dado months to recover. It would be about 50 more years before a treatment was discovered. So, though he survived, Modigliani had to live with the disease for the rest of his life. But over the next 6 years, Modigliani managed to suppress his illness and continue his studies in painting. He loved going to places like Florence, Naples, and Venice, all in Italy, to visit the museums there and study the work and technique of the Renaissance masters who he loved. And like a true bohemian at that time, he also spent many hours studying poetry, music, and philosophy. Then, in 1906, Dado moved from Livorno to what was then the capital of Bohemia, Paris, France. Paris was the center of the art world in the early 20th century. And if you wanted to be recognized as an artist, this is where you had to be. When Modigliani arrived, he tried to establish himself as more of a traditional or academic artist. And it wasn't long before he was hanging around or crossing paths with other famous artists like Pablo Picasso or the French poet André Salmon, Henri Matisse, Khayyam Soutine, our old friend Claude Monet, Diego Rivera, the wife of Frida Kahlo, who was featured last spring, and many others. Over the next few years, Modigliani tried to make a name for himself as a painter. He received a few commissions for portraits and frequently asked his friends to sit for him, but he deliberately avoided labeling himself with any of the isms or artistic trends at that time, like Impressionism or Post-Impressionism or Pointillism or Cubism. But it's easy to see in a few of his other portraits from this period some of the influence that might have crept into his work from some of the other artists with whom he was familiar. For example, in the blunt brushstrokes of this painting, which suggest a brief experiment with what was known as fauvism, with its vivid color and unusual brushstrokes, probably after closely studying the work of Henri Matisse. Or in this stunning portrait and stunning use of color and abstraction, which clearly shows the post-impressionistic influence of Paul Cézanne. But what was most obvious, however, was the influence of African art in Modigliani's work. Beginning in the 1870s, at the height of the French colonization of West Africa, scores of these African sculptures were pouring into Europe. Many artists like Picasso, Matisse, and Gauguin were intrigued by the fragmented cubistic shapes. They were fascinated by the pictorial flatness and abstraction in these pieces. And because they were valued so little at the time, they were easy to find at flea markets for very little money. Modigliani fell in love with these African pieces. The man seen with him in this photo, Adolf Basler, a critic and art dealer at the time, once wrote, "They captivated Modigliani. He could not see enough of them. Soon he could think only in terms of these forms and proportions. He was transfixed by the pure and simple forms found in the elegantly styled figurines and masks along the Ivory Coast." Also around this time, in 1909, Modi, as he was known in Paris, became friends and started studying with famed sculptor Constantine Brancusi. This had a profound effect on Modigliani. Brancusi was a reductionist of sorts, as you can see in this photo of his sculpture called The Kiss. Art historian Herbert Reed once wrote of him, "Brancusi strove to find the irreducible organic form, the shape that signified the subject's mode of being, its essential reality." Modigliani was increasingly searching for this same simplification or purification of form. So, inspired by his friendship and studies with Brancusi, in 1910, Modi decided to abandon his painting and dedicate himself exclusively to sculpture. This, along with his own ever-growing fascination with African statues and masks, like the one you see here, would change the course of Modigliani's work forever and would define the style for which he would forever be known. This is not an African mask, but one of Modigliani's earliest sculptures. Carved in 1911, he would ultimately go on to sculpt more than 20 heads like this one. This particular head sculpture is located at the Barnes Foundation, where I'm a docent. It's located through these doors and up these stairs on a small mezzanine floor among many other ancient and medieval sculptures, all carved in either wood or stone. Like many of the other sculptures on this floor, Modigliani carved this head completely out of limestone. You can clearly see the influence of the African sculptures in this piece, with the almond-shaped eyes, the elongated head and nose, and the long, slender neck. And since he only sculpted about 20 of these stone heads, any museum or collection that's lucky enough to have one doesn't usually have any more than just one. Even an enormous major museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, which you can see here, only has one of them. And the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. only has one as well. So if you're willing to make the 4-hour trip between New York City and Washington, D.C., you have the rare opportunity to see 3 of these extraordinary sculptures. Modigliani only wanted to sculpt in stone. He believed that sculpture was sick at the time, that there was too much modeling in clay, and that the only way to save sculpture was to start carving again, directly in stone. He exhibited several of his head sculptures at the Salon d'Automne in 1912, and was starting to enjoy some recognition for his unique vision. But Modigliani was still battling the bacterial infection in his lungs. And being around all of the dust from the limestone was causing complications to his already fragile health. That, coupled with the high cost of materials, forced Modi to abandon his plans to continue sculpting. Years later, his friend and Chilean painter Manuel Ortiz de Zarate recalled, Modigliani's real longing was to work in stone, a longing that remained with him throughout his life. But around 1914, Modigliani started to make the transition back to painting, but his heart was still in sculpture. And to help cope with not being able to sculpt anymore, he continued to paint works like this, called caryatids. This one, seen on the right, is titled Pink Nude Caryatid, painted in 1914, around the same time that he was sculpting the heads. And around that time, Modi had also become somewhat obsessed with sculpting caryatid figures as well. Caryatids are sculptures originating in ancient Greece and found in Greek, Roman, and Renaissance architecture of female figures serving as architectural supports, taking the place of columns or pillars. Modigliani sketched and painted numerous caryatid portraits like this one, always with the plan to execute them into stone someday. Meryl Seacrest, in her biography of Modigliani, says that for him, the repetition of the caryatid theme would suggest allusions to death and fertility, and the idea of woman as divine intermediary. Despite his plans to create many caryatid stone sculptures, only one exists, which we can see here at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Located right next door to Monet's Water Lily Gallery, this is the only caryatid sculpture Modi was able to complete before his health cut his dreams short. In fact, one of his dreams was to create what he called a temple of beauty, where he could surround himself with his stone caryatid and head sculptures. But that dream would never come to fruition. But works like this were a pivotal link between his sculpture and his painting, and helped define his characteristic style. They were also crucial in leading him further down the path in his tireless pursuit of pure form and simplified lines. Between 1914 and 1915, Modigliani's health was getting worse as his struggle with TB continued. And as he tried harder and harder to suppress his illness and the constant urge to cough in order to hide it from others, he increasingly self-medicated with hashish and alcohol, which was giving him the reputation as a drunkard and an addict. However, in the summer of 1914, he met and fell madly in love with a woman who inspired and motivated him to clean up his act. Her name was Beatrice Hastings, and you see a portrait he painted of her on the wall next to him in this photo. And that painting is located right here at the Barnes Foundation on the south wall of Gallery 19. Beatrice Hastings was a British poet, journalist, and novelist. And after moving to Paris in 1914, she met Modigliani, and the pair began a pretty tumultuous 2-year relationship. Hastings was a very bohemian person, and though she and Modi were lovers, she had many other different partners, both men and women, and she wrote under at least 20 different pen names or pseudonyms. So she was quite a difficult person to pin down. Modigliani was attracted to strong, independent, intelligent women, and he was intrigued by Hastings. Their shared love of books and poetry fueled his creativity. But he had a difficult time understanding her. For example, She wrote many articles supporting the cause of women's voting rights under one pen name, but she also wrote articles against them under a different name. She was someone who enjoyed the mechanics of an argument. And while Modigliani certainly had a intellectual curiosity and attraction for Hastings, it led to a mixed bag of emotions toward her as well. In this portrait of Hastings, Modigliani has really stylized her face, almost to the point of this being a cubist painting. He uses sharp, blocky forms to exaggerate her strong, angular features, which I feel also illustrates the strength of her character as well. And up near the top of the painting, all the way to the right, you can actually see where some newspaper clippings had been pasted on the canvas, possibly in homage to Hastings's profession as a writer and journalist. This use of other found materials in addition to the paint, almost in a collage sort of fashion, was what some of Modi's Cubist contemporaries were doing at the time, like Pablo Picasso and George Braque. So I think it's safe to assume that Modigliani may have been experimenting a little bit with Cubism in this portrait, but still retaining his unmistakable style and voice. During a recent trip to the Art Institute of Chicago, another massive museum with a collection of 13 pieces by Modigliani, I got to see this portrait from 1915, also believed to be of Beatrice Hastings. The uncertainty about whether it's her or not comes from the title, Madame Pompadour, a bit of a playful reference to the historical figure Madame de Pompadour. Madame de Pompadour rose to a considerable level of power in the French court in 1752 by being the chief mistress of Louis XV. But she was also an influential patron of the arts and an artist herself. So, given what we know about Beatrice Hastings and the traits which both intrigued and confused Modigliani, I think the comparison and the reference is clear. The relationship with Hastings only lasted about 2 years, but it provided exactly the motivation and inspiration Modigliani needed to keep painting and refining his voice, despite the burning in his lungs, for which there was very little relief. Then, in 1916, Modigliani met this man, Leopold Swarovski. Born in Poland, Swarovski moved to Paris in 1913 to study art at the Sorbonne University at the École du Louvre. Also a writer, he started writing art criticisms during his studies at the Sorbonne, which led him to become very interested in contemporary art, which led him to meet and begin a friendship with Modigliani. In the 1910s, Modigliani had been represented by this man, an art dealer named Paul Guillon. But by around 1915, Modigliani felt that Guillon wasn't really promoting him or his work very well. So Swarovski saw an opportunity. And in 1916, he became Modigliani's main representative. The two struggling artists found a real kinship. Swarovski even rented an apartment for Modi to live free of charge and dedicated a room in his own apartment where Modigliani could work whenever he wanted. In this photograph, you can see Modi leaning on a cane. As his health continued to decline and he continued to become weaker, Swarovski's generous help and encouragement was just what Modigliani needed. With this newfound freedom, Modigliani could truly concentrate on perfecting his craft. In all of the work that came after Swarovski's help, there's a discernible shift in his style. The skin tones are more subtle and almost Renaissance-like. The lines are drawn more elegantly and delicately. There's a palpable confidence to the drawing with a much more controlled, mature use of his brushes and in his brushstrokes. with just a suggestion of the eyes, African mask-like features, a minimal use of line, and a background painted very sparse, so the focus is only on the subject of the painting. Dato has finally found a voice that is uniquely his own and is creating works like this one that people can identify with a single word. That's a Modigliani. Over the next few years, under the guidance and financial help of Swarovski, Modigliani produced his most memorable work. In fact, here at the National Art Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. again, all 13 pieces on display by Modigliani are from this period after he started working with Swarovski. The only exception being the stone head, which we saw and talked about a little bit earlier. Under Swarovski's wing, Modigliani continued to paint portraits like this one, titled Red-Headed Girl in Evening Dress, painted in 1918. This is a very revealing portrait of the unknown woman modeling for it. In 1918, it would have been considered very odd for a woman to wear her hair short like this, not to mention the amount of eyeliner and lipstick she's wearing, or to say nothing of the daring neckline of her dress and the relaxed, somewhat seductive pose she's in. In this portrait, Modigliani captures a moment in time when many men were heading off to fight in World War I, and many women, like the model in this painting, were enjoying their newfound freedom, embracing the bohemian lifestyle, exploring their sexuality. This is a portrait of a bold, modern woman. He also continued to paint portraits of his friends, like this one at MoMA, found across from his caryatid sculpture. It's a portrait of Anka Swarovska, Leopold Swarovski's wife. And it's a beautiful example of how Modigliani began mastering his technique and his voice, with the thin, smooth application of the paint for her skin, the delicate lines, the elegantly elongated features, the confident brushwork, the stylized pose, which, by the way, does bear a resemblance to the pose we just saw in the Red-Headed Girl in Evening Dress painting. And many other people wanted their portraits painted by Modigliani as well, including some notable figures like this man, French poet Jean Cocteau. But not everyone was happy with the results, and some even refused to pay out of disappointment because it didn't look like them. Cocteau did pay for this portrait, but didn't take it with him, explaining to Modigliani that it wouldn't fit in a taxi, but he never sent for it. Much later, Cocteau wrote about the painting. It doesn't look like me, but it does look like Modigliani, which is better. Now, before we continue, I would like to make everyone aware that the following segment does contain images of paintings depicting nudity. While the paintings are artistic in nature and in no way explicit or violent, if you are sensitive to such images, you may wish to switch to audio only for the next few minutes. So Swarovski knew that it was all very well to paint portraits, but if the subjects didn't buy them, the chances of encountering someone else who would were very small. If there would be any real chance of selling paintings, they had to do something different. So Swarovski asked Modigliani to start painting nudes. For Swarovski, this made the best possible business sense. Nudes were bound to make people stop and look. Modigliani had drawn nude figure studies in the past, but he never painted them. But at the request of his friend and mentor, Modigliani readily agreed. And the paintings he produced now constitute his best known works. He painted dozens of them, Swarovski supplied and paid for the models, so Modigliani had an almost limitless supply of subjects. Excited by the work, Swarovski organized what would be Modigliani's only solo show during his lifetime, which would feature 7 of these nude paintings. And since he didn't have his own gallery, Swarovski arranged for it to be held at a small gallery called Galerie Bivile, owned by this woman, Bert Weil. She was a small independent gallery owner who championed many unknown artists at the time, including Picasso, Matisse, and of course Modigliani. Weil was known to have a bit of a rebellious, fiery nature, and to promote the show, she placed 1 or 2 of the most provocative nudes in the front window of her gallery. It certainly had the effect she wanted. It stopped traffic in the street, but unfortunately, it also attracted the attention of the police station across the street from her gallery. The police confiscated the paintings and shut down the show. And though she eventually agreed to remove the controversial paintings from her window, and the police did allow the exhibit to reopen, the controversy had already done its damage, and it caused the show to not be much of a success. Only 2 drawings were sold. And feeling bad for her gaffe in judgment, Weil bought 5 of the paintings herself so that Modigliani didn't feel discouraged. But these new paintings are the summation of Modigliani's powers. Years after he began his search for the simplified line, he perfected it in these magnificent paintings. Also, masterfully mixing together several traditions across a single figure, with the African mask-like treatment of the face and the classical sensuous pose, which seems to echo the classic nudes of European painters like Francois Boucher, as you can see in this painting from 1745 titled The Brunette Odalisque. The famous art historian and museum director Kenneth Clark, in his book titled The Nude, wrote that these works are as simple, sensuous, and passionate as the poetry of Keats. I couldn't agree more. The paint expressing the skin is blended so perfectly, it's almost impossible to distinguish where one color ends and the other begins. And it also makes me wonder, what led to Modigliani's fascination with the masks? It's been suggested that he related to the masks, since they're meant to hide something or disguise a truth, like he had to do most of his life with his illness. But Merrill Seacrest suggests that his nudes reveal the essential nature of Modigliani. They are rapturous responses to the beauty of life, expressed and revealed brilliantly through the beauty of the female form. Around the same time as his failed solo show, Modigliani met this beautiful young art student who was studying at the Académie Sclerosis. Her name was Jean Hébuterne, and shortly after they met, she began posing for Modigliani, and shortly after that, they fell madly in love. She would become Modi's last great muse, and although they would never marry, she would be the last great love of his life. Jean inspired an almost ferocious output of creativity in Modigliani. He painted more than 20 portraits of her, more than any other person he knew before her. And by 1918, around the time he painted the portrait of her seen here on the right, he and Jean were already living together, and she was already expecting their first child. The ordered lines and subdued color palette in this piece convey a calm and tranquility that was most likely in sharp contrast to the ongoing struggle and turbulence Modigliani felt with his health. He portrays Jean so lovingly, with soft curves and gentle features, elongating her neck in a way that seems almost swan-like, draped in an elegant blue dress that lightly accentuates the curves of her body and the stomach of this expecting young mother. Also, Modi transforms his young lover into a queen or goddess with the way he portrays her hair in a conical style that is most likely a reference to the head jets or conical crowns seen in many relief sculptures of Egyptian royalty or gods. After she gave birth to their daughter, who they named Jean, Modigliani was ecstatic. A mutual friend of theirs named Lunia Tchaikovska once recalled Modigliani was absolutely thrilled. He adored this baby, and nothing else in the world existed for him except her. Soon after, Jean became pregnant again. But Modigliani wouldn't live to see the birth of his second child. In late 1919, the bacteria from the tuberculosis in his lungs that had plagued him for nearly 20 years migrated to his brain. And on January 24th, 1920, at only 35 years of age, Modigliani died of tuberculosis meningitis, the final result of his lifelong battle with tuberculosis. Jean was absolutely devastated. And tragically, only 2 days later, while being looked after by her family because she was so distraught, when everyone was sleeping, she snuck out of bed and leaped out of a second-story window, taking her own life and the life of their unborn baby. In one of his last portraits of Jean, he once again beautifully expresses the tranquility and peace that she brought him in the final months of his life. Once again, cloaking her in light blue and creating a sense of balance with the orange tones found in her hair and in the same tones found in the back of the canvas leaning against the wall to her left. And even though Modigliani was painting his famous nudes at this time, he never painted Jean or had her pose for one of his nude portraits. Her sensuality comes instead from the exaggerated, long sweeping lines of her body, the delicate sweeping lines of her neck and arms, the serenity of her gaze, and the soft tilt of her head. And just as he did in the first portrait we saw, he once again transforms and immortalizes his young lover into a goddess. But this time, it's through her pose, portraying her in the same pose from this painting from Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres from 1808 of Venus Anadyomene, the ancient goddess of love and beauty. In reflecting on the lives and work of these two extraordinary artists, one thing I think both of them had in common was the urgency in which they created. The sheer volume of their work almost seems to suggest that they were afraid of running out of time. It's clear they had a sense that their time was limited. In Monet's case, it was his rapidly growing cataracts and the imminent loss of his vision. And for Modigliani, it was a race against the clock before the incurable infection in his lungs achieved its inevitable conclusion. But that fear, that limited time, didn't paralyze them or stop them from creating. Instead, it made them all the more determined to accomplish their goals, to achieve something great. It made me remember a quote that I'd like to close with tonight by this man, scientist and author Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, in a recent interview, when asked if he feared dying or wished he could live forever, said this: "I fear living a life where I could have accomplished something and didn't. That's what I fear. It is the knowledge that I'm going to die that creates the focus that I bring to being alive. The urgency of accomplishment, the need to express love now, not later." Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me tonight for Lives Improved Through Art, part of our Improving Lives Through Art series at the MSAA. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I would love to answer some questions if you have any. I believe Christy is going to be coming back on in just a little bit. And here she is. Hey, Christy.
Hey, thank you so much for such a compelling and engaging virtual tour. We're so grateful for your continued guidance throughout all of our Improving Lives Through Art series events. I did compile some questions from our viewers this evening, so we have some that we can run through. And if I don't get to your question, we'll do our best to answer any after the program, so you can drop them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them. The first question comes from Rebecca. That big art installation in Paris that holds Monet's the big piece. Did that include the footbridge, or is there any part of it that features the footbridge?
No. So that installation in the Musée de l'Orangerie, I always have so much trouble pronouncing that museum. It's only the water lily ponds for those large canvases that he called his large decorations, or it sounds so much better in French, his grand decoration, was just focused on the water and the water lilies. And I think this is just my opinion. I feel like he really wanted it to be sort of immersive and to really kind of feel to have that feeling of being surrounded by the flora and the fauna, the water and the grass and the water lilies. But the footbridge was almost a separate series of paintings that you saw that all were sort of from the same angle, just through different conditions, obviously.
And on that same piece, is it available how long that took him to put together, to paint?
So he started working on them. For example, I don't know specifically like each panel, but I know that all 40 panels, or what ended up being 40 panels, were worked on for about 12 years, from 1914 to when he died in 1926. They were not exhibited until after his death at that large installation that we saw in Paris. That was the first place they were exhibited. And then in the 1940s is when, like the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City, bought those few that they had, and some other museums did as well.
And is it believed that Monet's favorite piece would be the footbridge, or did he have another favorite piece that he maybe favored?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I haven't read what he considered his favorite piece. I do know. I mean, he made it very well known too that those gardens at Giverny were his favorite place, and water in particular was really much more of an obsession for him. If you go back to his earliest paintings to those right before he died, he was always obsessed with being able to accurately represent water. And like I said, the Zen River in particular. So I'm not sure about the favorite painting or series, but I would definitely say anything that came from the gardens of Giverny were probably among his favorite.
And for Modigliani, do we know which of the sculptures was his last and where that might be located?
I'm not sure if it's known. I know that I don't know. um, um, I I will say that I believe he wasn't sort of doing them one at a time. I believe he was sort of sculpting them um, uh, simultaneously, and some of them have like very nuanced differences to them. And I believe part of the reason for that was I mentioned that temple of beauty that he envisioned creating. He was very serious about that. That was such a passion project for him. In fact, in the head that I mentioned, that's at the Barnes Foundation, you can see wax on the top of the head of the sculpture. And as I poked around a little bit more, it turned out that he would put candles on top of the stone head sculptures and burn them at night so that it looked like a temple, like an ancient Gothic temple or something. So he was really a romantic, and he had these very grand visions of, for his art. But if anybody is local or you make it to the Barnes Foundation, just take a peek on the top of the head of that sculpture. You can see actually the wax residue from him burning those candles.
That's a really interesting detail to note. And if I ever make it out there, I'll have to take a look.
Definitely.
And if one was to come across Modigliani's sculpture, any idea how much it would sell for or how much they have sold for in the past?
No, I don't. I do know one thing that I had to take out of this tour because it was just running so long was one of the most recent things that I was able to find that was sold at Sotheby's in New York on an auction, and it was Modigliani used to, he was always poor because he didn't have a job, in part because of his health, but in part because he was so focused on his art. He didn't have time to work. So never having any money, he would try to pay for things with quick drawings. If a bartender said, "Hey, pay for your tab," he would whip out a tablet and make a quick sketch of the bartender and try to pay him with the drawing. Sometimes there's writings where like people would like crumple them up and throw them away and say, this isn't going to pay the bills. Some of those drawings have sold at Sotheby's recently for like $70,000.
Wow.
And those are just these very small, it looks like he did it in like seconds. So I can't imagine what something as rare and as monumental as those sculptures were. I would probably venture to say that they're priceless. Some of his paintings have sold in the tens of millions, 40 million, 50 million or higher. So I'd probably say at least double that for those sculptures.
Wow. A lot of both Monet and Modigliani's art seems to be repetitions of the same thing. Jen had asked, is there any other artists who do something similar to that, or someone that could, research in the future?
Yes. Well, so like I mentioned, like, most of the Impressionist artists, and I mentioned a few, Renoir, Sisley, I'm trying to think of some others in particular, but they wanted to paint a same scene over and over again to see what it looked like in different light, in different conditions, like with the cathedral and the haystacks. Paul Cézanne is an artist that comes to mind that repeatedly would paint the same scene over and over again. In particular, I'm actually, when I talk about Paul Cézanne, I'm going to feature these paintings. But in the south of France, there is a mountain called Mount Saint Victoire that had a personal connection for Cezanne. It was near his childhood home, and it was something he always saw as he was growing up. So when he returned there in some of the final years of his life, he painted that mountain, I think, more than 60 times, in every possible condition, and it's just very beautiful and very touching. So I think that would be my biggest suggestion, is to check out Paul Cézanne's Mount. I think it means Mount Saint Victoria, or Saint Victoria Mountain, but Mount Saint Victoire.
That's great. And for the last question, do you have a favorite piece by each of the artists?
Ooh. I know that's always so hard. I have several favorite pieces. I will say this: my fascination with Modigliani started in 2017 when I first visited the Barnes. I was not familiar with his work, and the final nude that I focused on, where she's like reclining on, like laying on her stomach. There was something about that painting that was just so haunting to me. The Barnes Foundation is full with thousands of pieces of art, and it's very overwhelming. You walk out feeling like that was so much art. I can't remember any of it. But that piece in particular really stood out in my mind. And so I think to this day, that is my favorite Modigliani. But, after learning about the story of him and Jean Hébuterne, those beautiful, loving portraits of her are just very moving to me as well. So I would say those. That's why I included them here. For Monet, those two paintings at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is what first tweaked my curiosity about those footbridge paintings. It was a well-known fact about his cataracts and his vision. But when I saw those two paintings, it confused me, and I was, really intrigued me. So I just think that whole series is so poignant, that I love looking at that series of paintings in the order that I featured tonight. But great question. Thank you for asking that.
Sure. Well, those are all the questions that we have time for this evening. If you had a question that I didn't get to or you didn't ask, feel free to put it in the chat for the last few minutes, and we'll do our best to get the answer after the event. Again, thank you so much, Joe, for such a beautiful virtual tour and taking us through the lives of Monet and Modigliani to explore their life with art. I want to thank everyone for their attendance and for your continued and gracious support of the MS community, and of course, our generous sponsor, Publicis. Without all of you, we wouldn't have a program, and I encourage you to sign up for our last two programs of the Improving Lives Through Art series, which will be a paint-along in November and a tour of the MS Art Showcase participants and their art. These events are ones that you will not want to miss. So please consider joining. Thank you again, and have a great evening.